A few months ago, Indian companies were at a relative advantage compared to Chinese companies. Why? Because they were Indian companies. Now, the same advantage has now been flipped. It's a question about market access in terms of can Indian exporters continue to be competitive in the US? And if they are not, where are they going to diversify? Where are they going to go? Who are the alternate players and who are the alternate markets that they're going to engage with?
Your book, The Great Disruption, was published recently, and it speaks about the relationship between geopolitics and business and how this relationship is more crucial now than ever. The publication of your book comes at a pertinent time as we are seeing a pivot taking place in India following the imposition of 50% tariffs by its largest trading partner, the US. India has been making efforts to re engage with China following the tariff. How would you view this pivot, and what do you think are going to be its implications?
I think that there are many pieces to parse over here. So there is obviously national security, national interest that drives the policy decisions that governments are making. And there is a reorientation, as you mentioned, that is going on in terms of realignment, in terms of who is seen as an ally, who is seen as a potential partner for India to work with, and how to reorient some of the challenges that may be occurring in working with specific partners or looking at opportunities in engaging with others. So I think there is a lot of reorientation that is happening right now, which is a system in flux. And this is an area that is, I think, a topic where there's a lot of interest and everybody's watching to see what this means for the business community, what this means for economic relationships, and how national security interests are influencing the business orientation and the economic impact of these things.
Now, some say that India's pivot away from the US is necessary only till such time that President Trump is in power. So, another 3.5 years roughly. At the end of his term, a new president will be sworn in who might view the India US relationship through a more friendly lens and would want to re engage with New Delhi in a similar fashion before the tariffs were announced. Now, during these 3.5 years, say if India and China cooperate more economically, Indian and Chinese markets are likely to get even more closely integrated. Indian and Russian markets are likely to get more closely integrated. And India has also been finding more avenues to increase trade with a number of nations in an attempt to, at least in part, supplant its trade with the US, at least to some extent. For example, by diversifying its oil purchases. Now, after President Trump demits office, and given that this further integration between Indian and Chinese markets could take place, how easy or difficult will it be for India to shift focus away from China and towards the US?
I think that's a great question. And this is, I think, fundamentally the challenge that companies are facing, which is what are the long-term impacts or what are the long-term consequences of dealing with today it is about higher tariffs in a particular market, in this case, Indian exports to the US. I think ultimately this is a question about market access. It's a question about market access in terms of can Indian companies, can Indian exporters continue to be competitive in the US? And if they are not, where are they going to diversify? Where are they going to go? Who are the alternate players and who are the alternate markets that they're going to engage with? The problem, I think, is that there is this longer term consequence. The longer term consequence is if companies choose to build ties with other partners, or if companies choose to pause or cancel contracts with existing clients or partners or suppliers, then it makes it that much harder to re-engage, even if the tariffs were to go away in the future. So a simple analogy, we all have our own habits. We all have our own preferred model or brand of everything that we choose in our lives. And it takes a lot to change that. It takes a lot for us to think about, oh, should I reevaluate my decision about which brand of milk I buy? And usually we don't. We only do that when there is some reason. Maybe the brand that you want is not available anymore, or maybe you had some health issue and you were advised to change. So we only like big events force us to make these kinds of changes. I think that that analogy applies here as well. So once companies end up investing in relationships with partners, with suppliers, with clients, why would they change that unless there is some big reason to change that, right? So now, if it is the case that Indian companies and Indian exporters are no longer exposed to the US market, but instead end up developing partnerships and ties with those in other countries and other markets, those will be somewhat sustaining. They will be sticky. They will tend to last. They will tend to continue to be in place, even if the tariffs were to go away. And there is I think both upsides as well as some challenges that come with that. The upside obviously is clear that once you have these sticky relationships, they tend to stay in place. And they tend to build trust over time, and they tend to be more engaged over time. The challenge, of course, is that what are the consequences? Now, if you as a company are no longer in the market, in the most challenging environments, with the most exacting customers, with the highest technological innovation, then it's much harder for these companies to compete in those kinds of markets or to learn from the ecosystem. So you're in some sense being shut out, not just in terms of whether you are selling products or services to a particular market, but it's also about whether you are exposed to the most demanding or the most sophisticated or the most exacting customers and suppliers and technologies. I think that's the other consideration too.
Now, a lot has been said about what the impact of these 50% tariffs imposed by the US on India is going to be. Optimists say that it's hardly going to make any difference, while others view it more pessimistically, saying that Indian industries like textiles and pharma, which are in great demand in the US, are going to face a massive setback. They also say that the exchange rate of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar is bound to be impacted. Now, where do you stand in this debate?
I think it's a fair point. India relies much less on exports as a share of its GDP compared to some other countries. So India has a relatively low share of exports relative to GDP, whereas in some other Southeast Asian countries, it can be as high as 80%. So I think there is some reason to believe that the impact may not be as big as it might have been in other countries. But at the same time, I think there is going to be some consequences also in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, whether companies can have access to specific markets. Are you still going to be able to compete in that market, even in the future, if tariffs go away?
In your book, you speak extensively about US China competition and how it's rewriting the rules of global commerce. But we recently saw a situation whereby, while India was charged an additional tariff rate of 25% because of its continuing purchase of Russian oil, China, which is the largest importer of Russian oil, has actually increased its purchases over the last few months and yet been spared the additional US tariffs. So my question is two-part. What explains this move by the US? And secondly, how exactly is the US China competition and cooperation, the balance between the two, shaping the global order?
I think that's a great question. In terms of thinking about this relationship between the US and China, I think there's a lot. Obviously, these are the largest economies in the world, and what we are seeing is exactly this idea that geopolitics is also about economics, or economics has a big impact on kind of the interdependence of economic interests and security interests. The interdependence of geopolitical goals in part is also dependent on how economic interests and specifically what roles companies play in this relationship. The question about whether there is this influence of imports of Russian oil and the tariffs that India faces versus that of China, there are questions, of course. We see this is a classic example of this interconnectedness or this interlinking of political versus economic interests, but also using both political as well as economic tools as leverage. What we also see is that the major feature that is defining whether companies are facing an advantage or disadvantage is really about where they're from. A few months ago or a year ago, Indian companies were at a relative advantage compared to Chinese companies. Why? Because they were Indian companies. Right? So some of it had to do with their technology and their products and the capabilities that they had, but a lot of it had to do with the fact that they were Indian companies relative to Chinese companies. Now, the same advantage has now been flipped. That what used to be an advantage has now become a relative disadvantage. So it really is the case that corporate nationality matters, and that is in some sense the defining feature of what the geopolitical risk that companies are facing.
Right. Now, over the last few years, there have been a number of events which have caused disruptions in the world order. It started with the Russia-Ukraine war in February 2022, which is continuing, and now we have Israel's war in Gaza. Now, because of this, there have been several supply chain disruptions, for example, in the case of oil and a myriad of other products. Now, do you think the relationship between geopolitical changes taking place currently and businesses is more crucial than ever? And how are companies impacted by these massive changes?
If you look at some of the data, there are some studies that suggest that actually the stock market reacts pretty quickly. And in some instances, the stock market reaction is not very big. So we might be tempted to believe that actually these types of geopolitical events that you're talking about don't have such a big impact on what companies are doing. I would say that's probably only one level of thinking, and there is a deeper level that we tend to see the impact. And the deeper level is really the building blocks. What is holding up the ability of companies to operate across borders? What is making it possible for a company from one country to go and invest in a faraway location, that they can be sure that they're going to be paid, that their assets are going to be safe, that they can even sell their products and services in that market? And with the type of geopolitical changes that we are seeing, whether this is about security interests, whether this is about tariffs, whether this is about export controls, all of these are various tools, but all of these tools are really fundamentally reshaping the building blocks that go to support companies' foreign expansions. So tariffs, for example, will restrict your ability to compete in another market. These types of changes are impacting whether companies are going to compete on a level playing field. Now, is it the fact that an Indian exporter of shrimp has better products or services than a competitor from, say, Vietnam or Ecuador? That's no longer the question. We're asking, what is the tariff rate that exporters of shrimp face if they're from Ecuador or Vietnam or India? So really the question about level playing field is central over here. And we've moved away from this idea that anybody can compete as long as their products and services are the ones that we are making a decision about, to a world where we are really asking, the playing field is not really level. It depends on where you're coming from. And again, tariffs are one example of how we see this playing out. And then, of course, there is this question about security of assets, of investments. So to what extent are companies confident that their investments in another country are going to be safe, that they can repatriate returns from the investments that they make? Are there going to be restrictions on the cross-border transfer of revenues? And to what extent they can feel confident in moving their people to another location? So I think these are the ways that we see conflicts and other types of geopolitical events reshaping basically the fundamental building blocks that allow and uphold the ability of companies to invest in foreign markets and compete internationally.
Now, innovation is yet another arena which major countries are putting their weight behind. There has been a massive rise in the use of AI in scientific technology, etc. At the same time, in a country like India and other developing societies, the government is focusing on the growth of startups and MSMEs. Now, do you think these global disruptions are bound to stifle these smaller players and also compromise the potential of innovation?
So innovation is at the center, it's at the heart of geopolitical competition. For various reasons, but also the contest between nations in terms of their national security and their ability to defend their own interests, really is underlying feature is going to be how innovative those societies can be. And to what extent you can have access to the most cutting edge technology. Now, because technology is at the center of geopolitical competition, it also means that there are all kinds of restrictions and all kinds of challenges to companies innovating globally, to accessing the inputs to be more innovative. Even if you're a small and medium-sized enterprise, you tend to rely on various forms of global inputs to be able to succeed as an innovative company. And when this becomes at the center of restrictions and there's more government oversight over what types of technologies, what types of materials, what types of use cases are we going to see if we export this technology, or allow companies from other countries to be able to peep in under the hood and see what's happening over there. I think this is going to create some kind of a chill in terms of how innovation progresses along certain technological trajectories. And certainly, it's going to be much harder for small and medium-sized enterprises to be able to access and continue to compete in this global innovation landscape than it is for much larger companies.
Now, can you speak a bit about a point that you made earlier about the interdependence between business organizations and governments? Is it a relationship of equals, and to what extent do they depend on one another? And what are some of the major problems which could impact this interdependence?
If you think about several years ago, there was this idea that we have these multinational corporations, they're getting really big, and some of them are so big that they're actually stateless organizations, right? And if we think about that narrative, I think one thing for us to be cautious about is that actually the state is quite a large presence, even for these types of multinationals. Even when you have these multinational corporations that seem to have bigger budgets than some countries even, they still, at the end of the day, are relying on states to either open new markets for them or are finding out that governments actually have a very strong role in closing markets or reshaping their markets or influencing the revenues that they can generate. And this relationship between states and markets, I think, is actually super interdependent. The governments rely on companies and their foreign investments as a tool that they leverage in geopolitical competition. But at the same time, companies are highly dependent on governments to shape the nature of competition and where they can compete and where they can expand and how they make money and generate revenue. So they're actually very highly interdependent, and they function as one arm of the other.
One final question. In your book, you make a point about how geographical location matters a lot when it comes to tackling geopolitical risks as well as business risks. So where you're from, that's what deciphers how ably you'll be able to manage these risks. So can you please elaborate on that point?
Sure. I think a fundamental feature that companies should recognize about managing geopolitical risk is that geopolitical risk is a function of corporate nationality. It depends on where you're from. It's less about competition in terms of product characteristics or the innovativeness or customer service or other types of marketing that a company does, and more about where this particular company is from. If we think about the example of tariffs, now, whether, if you are a textile exporter, whether you can be competitive in, say, the US market is going to depend on the tariff levels that you face. The tariff levels are not distinguishing between capabilities of particular companies. The tariff levels are not distinguishing, or not making any distinction between companies that have high quality versus low quality. They're not making any distinction across companies in terms of the most innovative production processes or other types of characteristics. They are making singular distinction based on the country or the country of origin or the corporate nationality. And so this is the fundamental feature. The problem, of course, is that most companies have much more control over and much easier for them to navigate things like, I can invest in production technology. I can invest in improving my improving the quality of my products. I can invest in hiring better people and being more innovative. But it's much harder for a company to say, I'm going to change my nationality. It's not that companies haven't tried, but it's a much harder thing for them to do. So the fundamental feature, if we acknowledge that the fundamental feature really is that corporate nationality is the one that is driving the extent of risk that a company faces in global competition, then we also have to reorient and ask ourselves, what exactly can a company do to manage this risk? And really, in managing that risk, you then have to go back to thinking about what are the types of actions that a company can take to either reorient maybe its location in terms of moving some of its location of control, partnering with other companies, creating more localization. So these would be the types of activities that really enable companies to be more competitive in a world that is driven by geopolitical interests and where corporate nationality is the defining feature of geopolitical risk.
Thank you so very much for your time.
Thanks a lot for having me.